Alrighty then. Or if you prefer, okay then. Hello and welcome to Question and Answer, episode number 183. I am your host, Panyo Basel, and I'm sitting here on a gray, dark, overcast, rainy day in upstate South Carolina. And this is my beverage. And 183, although odd, is not prime because it is 3 times 61. And with that as a kind of pointless preamble, suppose we should just get right into answering questions here. And there's not a whole heck of a lot. I think some of the viewers are hibernating over the winter or something. And it's a little unfortunate that the very first question is kind of diving into profundity right off the bat. I like to have a few easy questions or kind of superficial ones so that I can build up some momentum before I get into like the really like deep philosophical stuff, but it's not going to happen this time. Dhamma River says, why do Buddhas teach the Dhamma after reaching enlightenment? And that is essentially the question, but then he's got a couple paragraphs here of kind of commentary, which may amount to a second question. We'll have to look into this. He continues, if we were truly completely empty, then there would be no point in teaching anything, and Buddhas would simply remain quiet and peaceful until the body passes away. This proves that duality is real to some extent. However, it doesn't disprove anatta either. What it proves is that we are trapped and deluded by a simulation that the Buddhas are trying to wake us up from. What's your opinion on this? Well, I guess I should just go up to the first question, the question mark. The first question mark. Technically, there are two question marks. One question mark and then another question mark. So we'll deal with the first question mark first, which is, why do Buddhas teach the Dhamma after reaching enlightenment? And I have to admit, like the official reason that you see in the Pali texts is not persuasive to me because it's compassion, anukampana, which is, literally means like trembling after, it's sort of like being concerned for the welfare of others, not wanting them to be in danger and so forth. But like a fully enlightened being, he would see through samsara, realize that all of these beings are ultimately illusory, virtual reality. And so, that really has never been a persuasive answer for me. So, where do I start on this? One way of answering this, why do Buddhists teach the Dhamma after reaching enlightenment? It's very similar to one of the most common Zen koans. One of these paradoxical riddles that has no answer. And that is, why did Bodhidharma come from the West? To China in order to teach Buddhism there. Why did he do that? And that is like a koan. It has no real, legit, correct answer. But also, I'm reminded of a statement that I've repeated on these Q&As a number of times. A statement made by Ram Das with regard to his guru, Neem Karoli Baba, also known as Maharaji, who is up there on top of the bookcase. At least his picture is. He's not really up there. Unless he's everywhere, of course. So anyways, Ram Dass said that the more you got to know him, the more you realized that there was really nobody there. That he was just a mirror, like reflecting your own karma back at you. And that's one way of interpreting why Buddhists teach. There's really nobody there. It's just a mirror reflecting your own karma back at you. And people that had a lot of good karma, a lot of spiritual, leading up to enlightenment kind of karma, they wouldn't have a lot of opportunities for that to be reflected back at them until they perceive that there's an enlightened being who is more likely, partly due to their own beliefs, their own faith, maybe, to reflect that kind of karma back at them. But it's like your own karma to hear what a spiritual teacher has to say to you. So it's really the fruition of your own karma to have a Buddha teaching you Dhamma. I mean, what he's teaching you is already kind of latent in potential form, already inside you, in a sense. So that would be my best answer for why a fully enlightened being who makes no karma has no volition, or at least no samsaric volition, no cetana, no will, why they would bother to teach Dhamma. Because it's just a reflection of your own good karma coming back at you. Maybe a little bit of bad karma coming back at you too. For example, if an enlightened being scolds you for some reason, hits you with a stick or something. So anyways, let's just go on to the subsequent 2 paragraphs here. If we were truly empty, then there would be no point in teaching anything, and Buddhists would simply remain quiet and peaceful until the body passes away. Well, I mean, Buddhists do remain quiet and peaceful. Inwardly, they are quiet and peaceful. You know, it's, again, like the old Zen saying that the meditation hall can be resounding with the shouts of the master, and blows from his stick can be falling like rain, but still the master is dwelling in silence and stillness inwardly. So let's see here. Then the next statement is, this proves that duality is real to some extent. I mean, yeah, from a samsaric point of view, it's virtually real or conditionally real. Within the context of samsara, duality is samsara. I mean, samsara is based on duality or just perception, and perception requires contrast, and contrast is duality. You can't just have something completely in isolation. You have to have something to compare it with or contrast it with, something for it to be different from. And that's duality. Okay, so anyways, let's see. He continues here. However, it doesn't disprove anatta or no self either. What it proves is that we are trapped and deluded by a simulation that the Buddhas are trying to wake us up from. What's your opinion on this? Well, the Buddhas, for them to be trying, subjectively, all bets are off, because you can't really say what's going on with an enlightened being subjectively. It could just be silence and stillness, in which case, all the stuff that they're doing, like I was saying, is just a mirror reflecting your own karma back at you, with really nobody being there anymore. So that would be my answer. It's not so different from my first answer. And I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here, which is also from Dhamma River. I just arrived in Sri Lanka today. This was days ago. So he's in Sri Lanka. Okay, I'll just start over. I just arrived in Sri Lanka today, and I'm headed right now to a forest monastery where I will stay for a few months. With your knowledge of Sri Lankan Theravada Buddhist tradition, do you have any words of advice so that I can maximize the benefits of my stay here, and maybe things I should watch out for? Thank you. Okay, well, Sri Lanka, I really don't know a whole heck of a lot about the Sri Lankan Theravada forest tradition other than what I have read in a few books. And excuse me, I'm taking a drink of my beverage here. So, I've met a few Western monks who spent time in Sri Lanka, presumably in the forest tradition. My understanding is that Buddhism in Sri Lanka, for the most part, is very corrupt. It's rare to find a monk who follows the rules of monastic discipline, for example. You'll see in Sri Lanka more than anywhere else in Theravada Buddhist Asia, like monks with jobs carrying briefcases, driving to work, that kind of stuff. So, excuse me. My first advice would be just, if you are going to Sri Lanka to be in a forest tradition, make sure that you're in one of these kind of newish forest traditions that are like reform movements, where they really are trying to practice Dhamma correctly, including rules of monastic discipline for monks. Not handling money, for example, not eating food in the afternoon, that kind of stuff. And I guess there is like a reform movement in Sri Lanka where there are monks there now in the forests who are taking Dhamma very seriously. So I hope Dhamma River is at one of these kinds of monasteries than the usual kind of monastery in Sri Lanka. I guess aside from that, the main advice I would give is, like in Burma, like if someone was going to come to Burma, my first advice to them would be very patient, because nothing's going to work right. The buses aren't going to run on time. The electricity is going to go off and on at random. The air conditioning might not work, even at the hotel, this kind of stuff. So you just have to be very patient. Just be willing to accept just about anything. And then just do your best. It's like, if it's uncomfortable, hot and sweaty and mosquito-y and that kind of stuff, well, I mean, that's part of the practice. I mean, I think for really like archaic Buddhist monks, the earliest Buddhist monks, just wandering around homeless, being bitten by mosquitoes that they weren't allowed to slap, and just sweating all the time, and just the discomfort and inconvenience of it all was a major part of their practice. Just being able to accept that, to be kind of at one with all that, is one of the most important aspects of Buddhist practice, in my opinion. And that's one reason why Buddhist monks nowadays probably don't make nearly the sort of spiritual progress that the earliest Buddhist monks had. I mean, the earliest Buddhist monks had the advantage of, the Buddha was either there or still in memory. And, there was still a lot of enthusiasm and like momentum going, whereas now it's just the momentum of tradition, largely. But still, monks nowadays are mostly living in relatively comfortable monasteries, and they know where their next meal is coming from. They know where they're going to sleep that night, and everything is relatively easy. And in the West, it can be even easier. I mean, just living at the standard of living of an early Buddhist monk is downright illegal in the United States, unless you're a homeless person, in which case laws don't apply to you. So, I mean, maybe you could work something out that way. Try to get yourself qualified as I guess homeless is now considered politically incorrect. So it's like, what is it? Houseless? Unhoused? But I'm deviating from the question here. I'm digressing. Yeah, be very patient. Remember that any kind of difficulty is just part of the practice. That's just something that's being tossed at you so that you can accept it with equanimity. Even if it's something that has to be fixed, you've got visa problems or something, still, I mean, you don't just say, well, I just have to accept that, my visa's expiring, or I have to accept that I'm sick or whatever. I mean, you still have to take actions intelligently, prudently, but still, I mean, it's while you're sick, you accept the feeling, you observe the feelings with mindfulness. You've got, Montezuma's Revenge, or the Sinhalese equivalent of Montezuma's Revenge. There's a good chance it's going to happen. Well, that's just part of your practice. The heat, the sweat, the mosquitoes, the weird food maybe. It's all just part of the practice. And just learning how to deal with that with some mindfulness and equanimity is possibly more important than sitting cross-legged with your eyes closed meditating. But good luck or good karma, good kamma. And sadhu, sadhu, sadhu for toughing it out in a forest in Sri Lanka for the purpose of spiritual progress, realization. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Cherzaskazis. And Cherzaskazis says, I am sorry for a personal question, if it will in fact turn out to be a personal question. And then he says, were you ever sewer slidal? Now I'm supposed to say certain words on YouTube because it dings some AI filter and like demotes you in the algorithm if it doesn't just get you suspended, or the video taken down outright. So, was I ever inclined towards self-deletion is the question. And I mean, obviously, I was never fully persuaded with regard to that because here I am. At least it seems like I'm here. So, yeah, I was never 100% inclined on self-deletion. Otherwise, I would have self-deleted. Although, I mean, for a long time, I mean, it was always kind of an option. You know, it's always on the list of options. If things just get too horrible, then, you know, that is kind of an option. Or at least that is the way I was thinking as a monk. You know, um, you know, you get some sort of terminal condition that you know is just going to get worse and worse, and it's very painful and so forth. Then I could understand how self-deletion could be a wise and conscious choice. I mean, to self-delete in a state of just agonizing despair, which is the way it often happens, then, I mean, that's really not a good way to go, because you want to leave this realm in as conscious of a state as possible, because that's going to help determine where you're going to be immediately after this. You know, there's going to be like a continuum of mental states. But when I was a monk, just as a kind of option that I never took, I did consider it sometimes when things were really, you know, just very difficult to accept, that I did have a kind of, how do I put it, a certain toxic substance on hand just in case, which I never use. And I'm not going to say what the substance is because it's so easily obtainable and doesn't result in like nausea and convulsions and so forth, like most toxic, like overdoses would cause. That I don't want to help anybody with regard to this sort of thing. But it's true. I went to a library in Rangoon one time. It was the International Institute for Advanced Buddhist Studies, and they had at least one book on forensic science, like a coroner's manual. I assume they would have that in a Buddhist studies library because of the pictures of, you know, gruesome forensic stuff. You know, it had some pretty gruesome pictures in it, you know, shotgun wounds and this kind of thing. And it had like an appendix at the end, which was just toxic substances and their symptoms and so forth. So I studied through that a little bit just to see what kind of toxic substance would be preferable. But again, I didn't avail myself of that option, and I am glad that I didn't. It's just not my time to go. But I have considered it many times over the course of my life as an option which was rejected. And so I'm just going to move on to the second question of Cherzaska's, which is as follows. Are you sure you never ate dog or cat meat when you were living on alms in Burma? And I'm pretty sure. I'd say the odds of my eating cat or dog meat would be 5% or less while I was going for alms in Burma, partly because it's considered very low status to eat dog or cat meat, even as a layperson in Burma. Cat meat is more commonly eaten than dog meat. Dogs are just considered to be dirty, nasty animals, which is, you know, the prevailing view throughout much of Asia. You know, they eat garbage and dead lizards and baby poop and this kind of stuff, and they're just considered to be unclean. And so it's not a common, like an ethnic thing in Burma to eat dog meat, except there are some people who believe that eating dog meat can cure you of malaria. You know, it's just some weird folk myth, I guess. I doubt that it really helps unless it's just the placebo effect. You know, you have enough faith in this dog meat that it's going to cure you of malaria that somehow it helps anyway. Cats, on the other hand, yeah, I think some of the poorer villagers will like hunt stray cats and eat them. And that's one reason why you don't see very many cats running around in Burmese villages. Although the main reason is just that you got all these dogs running around Burmese villages, so that the cats are pretty much existing by stealth. But there are some Burmese villagers who like cats and keep cats. And I will point out, just gratuitously, that Burmese cats are similar to Siamese cats. Oh boy, low battery. I forgot to plug in the computer again. Just a minute. I keep doing this. You know what I'm saying? Let's see. I gotta plug this. I gotta stand back up again. All right. Okay. Now we're getting somewhere. Plug this in. Okay. We're down to 8%. Let's see. Gotta make sure that it's working good now. But I think we're okay. Let's just click on this. Okay. Oh, it says battery is not charging. Okay, now it doesn't say battery is not charging. Okay. Well, let's just see what happens. Anyways, back to Burmese cats. Like, a lot of Burmese cats have a kink in their tail, like Siamese cats. I've read or heard that a genuine Siamese cat has a kink in its tail. And I've noticed that's very common in Burmese cats too. I think they did away with that in, like, I don't know, like, what is it? The American version of the American Kennel Club for cats. The American Cat Kennel Club. That they probably got rid of the kink in the tail just because it's not aesthetically pleasing or something. You know, they're kind of posh, uppity kind of people that do that kind of stuff. So they probably didn't like the kink in the tail. And we're still holding steady at 8% battery power. So we'll just have to keep an eye on that. So poor people, poor villagers, some poor villagers in Burma, and probably poor city people in Burma, eat cat meat. But I've never heard of it being offered to monks. You know, it's just kind of something that you do secretly because the owner of the cat might find out and get pissed off. That kind of thing. Ooh, we're up to 9%, so that's a good sign. So, I mean, there's one time I ate something. I got some kind of meat in my bowl. And at first I thought it was like chicken or something. And then I realized that it was a quadruped. And then I'm thinking, man, this looks like rat. And I asked one of the Burmese monks at the monastery, like, what is that? And he assured me that it wasn't rat. It was probably gopher. That, you know, I thought maybe squirrel. I was kind of hoping squirrel instead of rat. I don't know why. I guess Americans just have this prejudice against eating rat meat. Whereas in some countries like Thailand, it's just a fairly common thing. Or so I have been led to understand. But who knows? Maybe gopher meat's really good. I've heard capybara, also a rodent, is supposed to be really good eating. So just because it's a rodent doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. I guess the guinea pig was domesticated early on in South America, I think, for a meat animal. I guess the dormouse in ancient Rome that was like gourmet eats, it's also a rodent. So I guess just because it's a rodent doesn't mean it's bad, but I've completely digressed from the dog or cat meat question. And we're up to 10%. So the battery is charging again. So let's see. Let's just move on to what technically is pretty much Terzaskas's question, but it turns out two people are asking questions on behalf of Siovaks and Sipad Zidana. Those of you who've been watching this for a while may recall that there was a questioner, a regular questioner almost every episode up until a few months ago, named Siovaks and Sipad Zidana. And then he got kicked off of YouTube. So then he joined the Discord server. And then he has a kind of personality trait where he like compulsively complains about certain groups of people or one person in particular. And finally, I mean, after a number of warnings, he kind of switched over to complaining about something else. I told him, just stop it or you're going to get ejected from the Discord server. And he just said, I don't care. And he quit. But now he's got questions. And I've been told he's too stubborn to get a new account on YouTube. And so I guess he's asking questions by proxy now. And so somehow he conveyed a question to Cherzaskazes to ask on his behalf, which is as follows. He says, please ask this for me. When a person is in a vegetative state, they are awake but have no awareness of the internal or external environment. This sounds like a form of pure consciousness without any content, but yet it doesn't seem like a good thing at all. What's the difference between this kind of state and nibbana? Because your definition of it seems very similar, quote unquote. Well, a vegetative state, let's see here. This seems awake. They are awake, a vegetative state. They are awake, but have no awareness of the internal or external environment. So, I mean, how do you know they're awake? Just because their eyes are open? I mean, they have no awareness of the internal or external environment. They wouldn't be responding to any stimuli. You know, they'd just be, I mean, it'd be like being in a coma with their eyes open. And I have to admit, I did meet one person like this in Burma. Some young Burmese guy, like a teenage boy, who he was born this way apparently, and he was so brain damaged that really there was just nobody there. I mean, his mother would say he kind of responds to certain things, you know, like they can get him to eat food, I guess. I mean, he was still living at home, but I mean, when he was, they'd prop him up. You know, they brought him to me when I was a monk, and maybe for some kind of blessings, you know, for his benefit somehow. And I mean, he's looking right at me, but he obviously doesn't see me. So, I mean, it was like there was nobody there. Anyways, let's see. When a person is in a vegetative state, I'm not exactly sure what the vegetative state would be if they are awake and have no awareness. I mean, wouldn't being awake imply that you're aware of something? Yeah, this question doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm not exactly sure what the vegetative state, quote unquote, would consist of, because he says they're awake, but on the other hand, they have no awareness of the internal or external environment. So what are they aware of? And if they're not aware of anything, how can they be called awake? So, Siovakchin Sipad Zirna continues, this sounds like a form of pure consciousness without any content, but yet it doesn't seem like a good thing at all. I mean, it might not seem like a good thing just from a human, like, instinctive point of view, because that person's obviously got something wrong with them. If they're just like that person I met in Burma, I mean, it looks like they're severely brain damaged. And so just from like the animal human nature point of view, it's like, there's something not good about this. You know, it's like we have just an instinctive desire to avoid people that have something seriously wrong with their health going, unless it's like a close family member, a dear friend, something like that. But, you know, you're walking on the highway, you're walking down the sidewalk, not the highway, walking down the sidewalk, and, you know, you see somebody who's just completely out of it, maybe all messed up. Some people would just rush over and, you know, maybe start doing CPR or something. Other people would just kind of stand back and call 911. Keep a safe distance just in case it's contagious or whatever. So, I mean, when he says it doesn't seem like a good thing at all, that you've got a person in a vegetative state who's somehow awake yet at the same time oblivious to their environment, internal and external. I don't know how that's even possible. But somehow, let's just, for the sake of argument, say that if that is the way it is, then just the fact that they're like in this abnormal state could just instinctively cause people to think that that is not a good thing at all. But I mean, how could it be good or bad? I mean, if they're just oblivious, you know, somehow awake yet totally oblivious to everything, at least anything we can, internal or external, which seems to pretty much rule out everything, then, I mean, how could that be good or bad? It would just be like a neutral state, it seems like, other than just sort of like the instinctive human reaction to something that's like obviously dysfunctional and abnormal. So ultimately, the question here is, what's the difference between this kind of state and nibbana? Because your definition of it seems very similar. Well, I mean, if you're enlightened, then, I mean, it's like infinite consciousness. And, I mean, if there are some people who would say that trees are fully enlightened, Eckhart Tolle would say that, an ant is fully enlightened. A cat is fully enlightened unless it's somehow become neurotic through too much interaction with humans. I mean, you could say that, I guess, but it's sort of like kind of like Eckhart Tolle just kind of has like this spectrum of unenlightenment with enlightenment at both ends. You got the enlightenment of an ant or a paramecium at one end, and you got the enlightenment of a Sambuddha at the other end. And he somehow, I don't recall his explanation in his first famous book, The Power of Now, exactly what the difference is between the lower end enlightenment of an animal, say, and the higher end enlightenment of a Buddha. That there is a difference. I remember he specified there was some kind of difference. That the lower end is just kind of like an inferior kind of enlightenment, sort of like the Mahayana idea of like an arahant, as opposed to a Buddha, like an enlightened bodhisattva. But let's see. First of all, I have a problem answering this just because the whole premise of someone who is awake yet oblivious to everything internal and external. I mean, how is that awake? That's just like, yeah, that doesn't make sense to me. But then, yeah, it not seeming like a good thing at all. I mean, being enlightened would be subjectively not necessarily a good thing because it would be neutral. Good and bad, that's the duality, a samsaric duality that you dispense with. So what's the difference between this kind of state and nibbana? Well, if you think a brick is in a state of nibbana, then there wouldn't be much difference. But, I mean, it wouldn't be full enlightenment, I think, simply because, I mean, it's like there was no karmic stream that gets transcended or some such. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, it's second guessing somebody like that person I saw in Burma, who there was obviously nobody there. I mean, they were just oblivious. They had like the sensitivity of like a plant or something. They seemed to kind of be aware if someone was around them and like being nice to them or something, but still obviously it's like they weren't seeing or hearing or anything like that. So, I mean, second guessing the mental states of a person who apparently has no mental states, and also second guessing a fully enlightened being who has transcended mental states. I mean, that might be the difference, at least with regard to like someone who is still embodied. It's like one person isn't having mental states. The other person has mental states, but they've just like transcended them and they become irrelevant because that is no longer like what they're focused on. But then after the like parinibbana, then yeah, who knows? It's like there could be that kind of absolute that is not obscured in the brain damaged person. But that's kind of a weird sort of thing to investigate because really you're just trying to second guess what's going on in the mind of a person who is essentially mindless. Got no more mind than a plant, maybe. That's why they're called vegetative, I guess. So, I mean, you could just have a plant instead of the person in the vegetative state and compare that to a fully enlightened being. Is that nibbana? And some people would say yes. I mean, it's not the kind of a nibbana that a Buddhist, or at least not a Theravada Buddhist, is going for, because the Theravada Buddhist is going for kind of a transcendence of mental states and not just the annihilation of mental states. And that's hard for a lot of people to understand because it involves thinking at two different levels of reality simultaneously. But you can get to a mental state where you're still having thoughts. It's just that you're no longer identified with those thoughts. That the thoughts are just nature taking its course because that's what the brain does at this level of reality. But your consciousness is not identified with that anymore. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cleefy. Although we haven't heard the last from Siovac and Sipad Zina because he indirectly asked another question through somebody else later on. I hope I included that on the list. I think I did. If I didn't, I'll have to look it up. Anyways, Cleefy says, if the block of marble represents every possibility and impossibility, does it mean that the Four Noble Truths are within the block? Does it mean that in a different realm, the Four Noble Truths don't necessarily apply? Well, the Four Noble Truths would be contained within the block in the sense that any perception would be contained within the block. And as George Berkeley used to say, esse est percipi, to exist is to be perceived. So any being who is perceiving the Four Noble Truths is like creating a version of the Four Noble Truths within the realm of anything that is possible. So that answers that question. The Four Noble Truths are within the block in the sense that the perception of the Four Noble Truths are within the block. And if the Four Noble Truths aren't being perceived by anybody, then they just wouldn't be there. I mean, they wouldn't exist. So the second part of this question, which is actually the second question, so I separate it now. Does it mean that in a different realm, the Four Noble Truths don't necessarily apply? Well, that's kind of like saying in a different realm is 2 + 2 = 4 not necessarily apply. And I mean, it's hard to imagine something like that. I mean, you can play number games, like base 2 number system. There is no 2 + 2 = 4, that kind of thing. But the Four Noble Truths don't necessarily apply. I mean, in some different realms, the Four Noble Truths just aren't an issue if nobody has discovered them and have started perceiving them. Although you could apply them like retroactively, or you could potentially apply them to what's going on, because it does seem to be the nature of perception that, first of all, you have to have duality. And what's going to drive this perception, if not like desire or like this restless dissatisfaction or dukkha that is going to push the mental states forwards with a kind of continuity and change at the same time, because there has to be both. And it's kind of tricky. I mean, there could be maybe there could be something else that drives some sort of unenlightened mind other than, and in some other version of reality, very different from ours. It could be like some kind of geometric patterns or something that has formed enough complexity that it becomes sort of self-referential and acquires a kind of unenlightened consciousness. But gosh, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that in a different realm, the Four Noble Truths don't necessarily apply, but it may be that you could have a kind of consciousness that is so alien that what is driving it through samsara is something other than this restless dissatisfaction, like the thorn in the heart that has beings of this world running in all directions, insatiably. The sala, going with the original Pali term, the Pali metaphor, the sala, that we all have this thorn or barb or spike embedded in our heart. And that's essentially unenlightenment. It's craving, desire, attachment, restless dissatisfaction. But theoretically, you could have some kind of consciousness that is motivated by something other than restless dissatisfaction, desire, and craving and attachment. I don't know what it would be. It'd be something totally alien to us. But even then, the Four Noble Truths technically would still apply in that desire is the cause of all suffering. So even if you have some completely alien sort of consciousness, completely alien sort of unenlightened mind that is fueled by something other than, desire and attachment and restless dissatisfaction, still, it would still be true that this desire is the cause of suffering. Not necessarily, I mean, how are you going to have, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're trying to second guess. First, we're second guessing fully enlightened beings, second guessing people in a vegetative state that have no mental states, apparently. And now we're second guessing totally alien consciousness that runs completely differently from our consciousness. Um, so let's just kind of get our feet back on the ground here, or on the floor in my case. Does it mean that in a different realm the Four Noble Truths don't necessarily apply? I think there could theoretically be some other kind of realm that isn't running on dukkha and desire, maybe. But still, the Four Noble Truths would apply to, at least the second and third Noble Truths would apply. The first Noble Truth, to exist is to suffer. I mean, maybe there's some kind of completely alien sort of consciousness that, I mean, sort of, you could say like a computer has a kind of like imitation consciousness, like AI especially. They might not suffer at all, even though they might have a kind of virtual intelligence or something. I mean, that might defy the Four Noble Truths in that sense, and that to the extent that they exist, maybe they're not really suffering. But this is another just tricky question. I'm just getting slapped upside the head with these tricky kind of questions where I'm having to second guess completely alien mental states. But I hope I answered it well enough, because I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, what is your opinion of secular professionals using techniques or concepts derived from Buddhism in their jobs? For example, would a mental health counselor taking something like a mindfulness meditation teacher certification training to use with their clients be insulting, exploitative, or blasphemous in some way to you? As a former Buddhist monk who took the authentic and arduous path of asceticism, do you see such certification courses as a cop-out or inauthentic shortcut? Well, I mean, there's different scenarios. For example, um, you've got some sort of psychologist or psychiatrist or counselor or therapist who takes a course in, like, what is it, uh, mindfulness for stress relief. There's some kind of certificate you can get for teaching mindfulness as a way of reducing stress reduction. And in and of itself, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's eclectic, but I mean, it's helpful. It's like people with terminal illnesses or like burn victims in hospitals, to have somebody teaching them how to detach from that, to observe it mindfully, not identify with it, the worry or the fear or the pain or whatever. I think that's ultimately a good thing. The only, I mean, like another example is, I've mentioned before, I used to know one of the world's leading authorities on obsessive compulsive disorder. He was a research professor at a major university in California at the time. And he used mindfulness, like Buddhist mindfulness techniques, satipatthana, as a way of curing people of obsessive compulsive disorder. Their symptoms wouldn't entirely go away, but they would learn to detach from it and not identify with it, and not just compulsively, follow through on the urges. So, I mean, that's good. That's a good thing. The only two things that would kind of bother me, they used to bother me as a monk. First of all, you've got like some professional, like a psychologist, who gets the certification in mindfulness as a form of stress reduction, just teaching mindfulness stress reduction techniques, and then starts considering himself to be an authority on Dhamma and, kind of equivalent to the Sangha, this kind, the Bhikkhu Sangha, this kind of thing. They kind of get arrogant. That can happen, and that would kind of bother me a little bit. And also, it did kind of bother me a little bit when I would see like an ordained Buddhist monk who would get the certificate on teaching mindfulness as a stress reduction technique. Like I met, he was a Zen Roshi. I think he made his real money like in real estate. He was some kind of real estate agent, but he was also a Zen Roshi, and he got the certificate. So he's teaching mindfulness not as a monk, but he's just teaching this technique developed by lay people for, reducing stress in people as a kind of therapy. And I mean, it's just kind of rubbed me the wrong way when you've got monks that kind of are favoring this watered down, westernized secular kind of Dhamma in preference to, the full system, the full Monty. So that kind of bothered me a little bit. But to the extent that it's helping people, I mean, you judge a tree by its fruits, right? So the actual helping of people is a good thing. But I think like some of the mental states associated with the teachers, like whether they're lay people who consider themselves to be, just authorities on Dhamma because of getting this certificate, or the monks who are supposed to be authorities on Dhamma traditionally, who then kind of step down to get this certificate to use Dhamma as a means of stress relief. When really, I mean, stress relief, ultimately, and that's the goal of just complete stress relief, just complete end of dukkha. But in a way, it's really watering it down, which happens a lot in the West, I guess, especially in the West. So, yeah, helping people in general is a good thing, but it can have like negative effects on the teacher. Still they're helping other people, so they're earning merit. They're gathering up treasures in heaven. But still it can result in like selling out their own tradition to some degree in the case of an ordained monastic who like goes to this lay institution to get this certificate that somehow makes them qualified to teach mindfulness. That always rubbed me the wrong way. And then of course that people can just kind of get these delusions of grandeur, thinking that they understand Dhamma when they just got this certificate. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from the saboteur, who actually changed his name because the saboteurs could result in confusion as to whether the saboteurs were one person or more than one person. And so he has clarified that he's only one person by removing the final S from his name. And now he is just the saboteur. And he says, I once had a girlfriend when we were aged 17, a long time ago. And I once saw her crying. When I asked why, she sobbed, if I didn't exist, no one would miss me. Neither of us were existentialists then, so I assumed she was just dumb. Your views, please. Well, it's just a common thing of human nature, I think, that people want to be remembered and missed after they are gone. That's one reason why some people just go for fame, just so that they'll be remembered. They want to be remembered for something. So, it is a common aspect of humanity, I think. And there's deeper, like, evolutionary reasons why people have these kind of desires. Strong interpersonal relations is conducive to survival and reproduction of your DNA sequences and all that. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what kind of input I can give to this. It just seems like this basic human nature. And of course, a 17-year-old girl is going to be more emotional and touchy-feely than than the average guy, I guess. So, I mean, they can cry over lots of stuff. You know, it's like people can cry over watching a dumb movie. People can cry over getting a puppy for their birthday. This kind of stuff. Especially some teenage girl who's very emotional. You know, it's like the hormones of adulthood are flushing through the system. She's all doped up on hormones anyway. And that works that way for teenage boys too. So, yeah, I mean, it's nothing out of the ordinary. I'm sure that there are plenty of people who have, male and female, mostly female, I would guess, who would cry because of the thought that, you know, if they died, I mean, here she didn't even say that if she died, it's just if I didn't exist, no one would miss me. I mean, if you never were born in the first place, of course nobody's going to miss you. So, I mean, that would be kind of silly, but it's still easily within the realm of the thoughts that teenage girls have. So, yeah, I would just chalk that up to teenage girl mentality. And God bless teenage girls. I got nothing against them. I'm sure some of them are very nice in a completely innocent, platonic sort of way. I'm not on the Epstein list. But, I mean, it's just human, to some degree, human irrationality, human emotionality, human sentimentality, doped up on hormones, intensifying it. But yeah, now that I've read this like 3 times, I'm not sure if she's crying because if she had never been born, no one would miss her, which is admittedly kind of a silly thought because no one would have known her in order to miss her. I mean, you can't miss what you've never experienced, pretty sure. Except for maybe, you know, somebody who's a 30-year-old virgin, just instinctively they kind of miss some kind of action, if you will. But I mean, if she's crying because if she had passed away, no one would miss her, then, you know, that's definitely more of a human, normal kind of sentiment to have. But I don't think she was just dumb. I mean, even really intelligent women can be like spectacularly irrational sometimes. I mean, if you haven't looked at it already, you want to understand women and just like a man's attitude towards women and everything. Just look up Hot Crazy Matrix on YouTube. And you'll see, like, on a scale of, I mean, women go from a scale of 1 to 10 with regard to their physical attractiveness. You know, that's standard. Guys have been using the 1 to 10 system for my entire lifetime, I'm sure. But with regard to the crazy matrix or the crazy axis, it goes from 4 to 10 because all women are at least a 4 crazy. That's really important for men to know. It has gotten me through a lot in life. So I guess I answered that one. So I'm just going to move on to the saboteur's second question. He says, I understand the Buddha was not in favor of numerology or astrology, etc. Can you please expand on that? Yeah, there are suttas. Like there's one sutta in the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata warning or just admonishing monks. They shouldn't be interested in astrology or omens, you know, like interpreting bird cries or interpreting dreams, like any kind of magic, any kind of fortune telling. All that stuff is monks aren't supposed to pay any heed to it. Also, even like consulting mediums in trance or channeling higher beings. That's the entire Sila Khanda of the Digha Nikaya, the first like 10 or so suttas of the entire Sutta Pitaka have that warning in it. That, I mean, there's certain things that a self-respecting, conscientious monk doesn't do, and one of them is like consulting spirit mediums, but also just like omens and fortune telling, all that kind of stuff. Astrology. I don't know if there's any particular mention of numerology, just because numerology wasn't really much of a thing in ancient India at the time. Because like written numbers and stuff, that sort of thing, were pretty much the province of like storehouse supervisors, you know, just keeping inventory of stuff in warehouses, that kind of thing. Maybe some minister of the king who's like recording tax revenues. But the average person was illiterate in the Buddhist time. They couldn't read or use numbers, at least not written ones. At least that's my understanding. But getting back to the actual question, there's two main reasons for this, I think, why monks aren't supposed to pay any heed to like omens or fortune telling, anything like that. Is one of them is that it's like the same reason why they're not supposed to practice medicine for lay people. They can practice medicine with their fellow monks, maybe with their own parents, but they're not supposed to be practicing medicine. It's against the rules of monastic discipline for a monk to practice medicine on lay people, like village supporters, that kind of thing. Partly because, I mean, lay people would just come to the monk for, to get cured. It's like that Jesus of Nazareth had this problem. I mean, you read the New Testament, there were times when he was exasperated, where it's like people didn't want to hear him teaching the gospel. They just wanted him to cure their Aunt Martha of rheumatism. There's that one scene where the Buddha, or not the Buddha, but Jesus is in this building teaching a crowd of people inside this building, and some other people break a hole in the roof and lower the sick person down on ropes just so Jesus can heal them. And the Buddha predicted that that's not good. If people are going to come to monks, they should come for Dhamma. They should come for spiritual guidance and not for getting cured of a disease or to have their fortune told or to have these omens or dreams interpreted, that kind of thing. So that's one reason. But another reason is it's just a distraction because it's not helpful for you to become enlightened. It's just like this sidetrack, like politics. Or even, let's just leave it at that. I mean, it's just not Dhammic. It does not help you to become enlightened, at least not from the ancient Indian Buddhist point of view. That being able to interpret dreams, it can be useful sometimes, and sometimes a dream is just, you can interpret it as this symbolic thing that has a clear message, and that's fine. But to be like studying up on it, reading books on it, and then like going out and like palmistry, that's another one. In Burma, there's a lot of monks who do palmistry. They'll read your palm and tell you all this stuff that, it's sort of like the horoscopes in the newspaper when I was a kid. There's like the Monty Python sketch. These ladies are reading their horoscope in the newspapers, and you're a prehistoric reptile, 25 feet long, with 6-inch fangs, and you wear spectacles. And the woman who's wearing glasses is like, ooh, that's uncanny about the spectacles. I do think that most palmistry and like numerology and so forth is along those lines. More miss than hit, but the hits are like get latched onto. It's like, ooh, that's big. That's a big deal. So getting back to the question, it always takes me 20 times as long to answer the question as to read the question for some reason. But yeah, one reason why monks aren't supposed to be paying attention to fortune telling and astrology and reading or like interpreting omens, that kind of thing, is because you want lay people coming to you for Dhamma and not for fortune telling and omens and dream interpretations, that kind of thing. But also, it's just a sidetrack that is not conducive to enlightenment. So monks should be studying how to become enlightened and not how to interpret dreams or how to figure out the numbers of your birth date to determine what your future is going to be, or the position of Jupiter, how that influences your personality. This kind of stuff is just irrelevant. Just reduce your desires, and that will reduce your suffering. To do good, refrain from doing evil, and purify the mind. And numerology and astrology and dream interpretation and interpretation of omens and all that just is not part of the equation there. So I'm just going to move on to the saboteur's last question. He says, lastly, because it is his last question, please give your views on BomJon, if I spelled it right. And I have no idea who BomJon is. I've never heard of any BomJon in my life. I've heard of Ram Dass, that Ram Dass, but Das does not resemble BomJon, so I assume that's not who he's talking about. Also, I remember there was a person called Da Free John, who was one of these supposed enlightened beings, sort of like an Eckhart Tolle type, or kind of a, Andrew Cohen type, these people, or an Osho type, who was kind of a cult leader or something. At least he was sort of a Hinduistic spiritual teacher back in like the 70s and 80s, if I remember correctly. Da Free John. Then he changed it to Bubba Free John after maybe, he was kind of less keen on trying to pass himself off as an enlightened being or something for whatever reason. But BomJon, no clue whatsoever. This is the first time I've ever heard of him, so I really don't have anything to say. I don't have any views on BomJon. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Raphael. And I may have to look at something in order to answer this question. It says, Raphael says, can you do the test and share your results? And this was on Discord. I'm going to Discord, even though you can't see me doing it. Okay. It's the Philosopher personality test. And the Philosopher personality test just asks you a bunch of questions, and you answer them, as truthfully as you can manage. And then it tells you of 8 famous philosophers, which one you resemble the most closely. And so let's just go here to Discord again. And the 8 philosophers were Aristotle, Epicurus, Kant, Diogenes, Plato, Hume, and Nietzsche. And let's see here. Okay. And so of those 8, somewhat surprisingly, I had like an 85% match with Epicurus. And I've never really studied Epicurus much. He was just kind of a secular philosopher with a relatively benign philosophy of, there are gods, but they don't really care about us. They've got their own realm and they just pretty much stay there. And Epicurus was largely materialistic, which doesn't match me very well. And he just had this simple sort of ethic of just live a simple life. Simple pleasures are the best pleasures, that kind of thing. Kind of surprisingly, I was only a 60% match with David Hume, who is one of my philosophical heroes. Only a 50% match with Diogenes, partly because I'm much less inclined than Diogenes to just blurt out offensive statements just for the fun of it, or just for the sake of principle or whatever. Although it's not surprising to me at all that I least resembled Nietzsche, because I really don't have a high regard for Nietzsche. There are some people who do, and that's fine. Different temperaments, different personality types, and so forth. But Nietzsche, I just was not much inclined to be impressed by his philosophy, and part of that was I just did not like his writing style. His writing style was just too emotive and poetic and touchy-feely for me. I prefer somebody like David Hume, who just explains things simply and clearly and succinctly. And so I'm glad that at least I had a 60% match with David Hume. I'm not sure why. I don't think that the test was entirely reliable. I was a fairly good match with Aristotle, and I got really very little use for Aristotle. I think I more closely resembled Aristotle than David Hume, which I took a little bit of umbrage to. Anyways, yeah, I think the person I most closely resembled was Epicurus, for whatever reason. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, if there is no free will, all of my karma is determined, it would also be determined based off of factors outside of my control, whether or not I would walk the Eightfold Noble Path. How is this not fatalism? Well, the thing is, the Buddha rejected fatalism. Like the Ajivikas were strict determinists. You had like 84,000 lives. You know, the analogy or the simile was a ball of string. You know, you hold on to the loose end and you just kind of throw the ball and it just keeps rolling and rolling and rolling until it's just reaches the end of the ball of string and you just got this long line of string. And that was how the Ajivikas, according to the Buddhists, interpreted like how rebirth happens. That, you know, you just inevitably have these 84,000 lives and there's no free will whatsoever. And that's it. After you get the 84,000th life, you're done. You're enlightened. And the Buddha rejected that. He said that, I mean, this kind of wrong view can result in hell even. That I'm not so sure about. Just to believe a philosophical doctrine like that, I'm not so sure that that would qualify a person for hell. So I'm somewhat skeptical that the Buddha actually said that. It could just be a little bit of religious polemics going on in ancient India that got into the texts, because the Pali texts portray all non-Buddhist philosophers, especially if they're not Brahmins, as just bungling fools. So I consider that to be a kind of religious propaganda going on. But still, determinism, strict determinism, is rejected. Like absolute free will is rejected in the Anatalakkhana Sutta, which is allegedly the Buddha's second discourse after his enlightenment. He said, with regard to any of the five khandhas, you cannot say, let it be this way, let it not be that way, and have it reliably happen. You do not have complete control over any of the five khandhas, and that includes will. Sankhara khandha is essentially our karma, and we don't have complete control over that either. So it's kind of a dilemma. It seems like the two alternatives of free will and determinism are both rejected in Buddhism, which leaves a kind of paradox. And I do think that the answer may be a kind of paradox, which I got the idea from a book called The Trickster and the Paranormal by George P. Hansen, who mentions in one of his chapters in this book, well worth reading by the way, that like when you're meditating, you become self-referential. You're observing your own mind. You're observing your own mental states. And even the average person that has self-consciousness, being self-conscious is a kind of self-reference. And like in Gödel's theorem, when a statement becomes self-referential, it can become paradoxical. Like the statement, this statement is false. That statement, this statement is false, is neither true nor false. Because if it's true, it's false, and if it's false, it's true. So, I mean, it requires self-reference to produce this kind of paradox that just kind of shatters rules of logic. And so it may be that self-reference in the human mind, especially when it's intensified through like meditation, mindfulness, wisdom, that it creates this paradox that can somehow allow for something resembling free will to occur. Even though free will logically should be impossible, still, like Aristotelian laws of thought, everything has to be either A or not A. So any statement has to be either true or false. But once you get in that self-reference, like this statement is false, the Aristotelian laws of thought explode. It can't deal with it. So it could be that being self-conscious, self-referential, the mind like perceiving itself or certain aspects of itself can result in this paradoxical state that allows for something along the lines of free will to occur. But I do admit that free will should be logically impossible. Either something has a cause or it doesn't have a cause. If it has a cause, it is determined and not free. But if it doesn't have a cause, it happens at random. And that's could be called freedom, but it'd be more like an epileptic seizure than making free choices. So let's see, did I answer the question? That is the question. If there is no free will and all of my karma is determined, it would also be determined based off of factors outside of my control, whether or not I would walk the original Eightfold Noble Path. How is this not fatalism? Yeah, fatalism is rejected too. So it's a paradox. I mean, in Islam, the only religion I can think of, aside from the extinct Ajivaka religion, where they just flatly reject free will as a general rule, would be Islam. Where, I mean, Allah, God, somehow has free will, but nobody else does, because Allah, I just said Gala, probably God and Allah combined. Allah is literally, according to Muslims, omnipotent. All power is with Allah. So anything that we do or not do, it's all has to be the will of God. So to the Muslims, they have this weird situation that's, I mean, right there in the Quran, that if you decide to be a Muslim, that's God's will. If you decide not to be a Muslim, that's also God's will. But then it's also God's will that you go to hell for not being a Muslim. So, I mean, at least they fess up to it. There's a lot of stuff that Muslims fess up to that's kind of embarrassing if you really examine it. Like the lifestyle of Muhammad, for example. But we don't need to go there at all, because this question is about free will and determinism. And yeah, my best answer is that it's the self-referential nature of the human mind creates this paradoxical self-reference, which then can allow something along the lines of free will to like come in through the cracks. And I might as well throw in that Ramana Maharshi used to say that the only free will we have is the choice whether or not to be mindful. And the more mindful you are, the wiser you are, the more choices you've got. But for the most part, we are pretty much, yeah, it seems that determinism is pretty much the rule, and that we humans maybe have managed to be a minor exception to the rule. I guess. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Watermocker. And Watermocker says, regarding dependent co-arising, if nothing existed, how was any karma created in order for samsara to arise? Well, this is assuming that you're going, that time is real, for starters, and that you had this beginning of time where nothing was happening yet. And that's not the way it works. I mean, samsara is just infinite in time and space. It's just infinite. No beginning and no end. So there's always been samsara. And if you go with this hackneyed, at this point, completely worn out theory, or the simile of the block of marble, you know, you got the block of marble, which represents the absolute, and contained within that statue, or that block of marble, is every possible statue. It's already in there. Every single molecule is already right in the exact place. You just have to use your imagination to separate out the extraneous rock. And so, I mean, that block of marble, which contains all possibilities, has contained all possibilities always. No beginning and no end to those imaginary statues. And we are some of those imaginary statues. Or you can say they're virtual statues, conditionally real. But there's no beginning to that. It's always been this way. And it's, to some degree, that caused me some like mild depression, maybe, when I was a monk living out in the forest in Burma, when I realized that, I mean, even if you go with Einsteinian physics, with time being the fourth dimension, that still after you become enlightened, the unenlightened suffering you is still real. You know, it's still there, just behind you, temporally speaking. And all the statues, including every possible version of a miserable, messed up you, is always going to be in there. It's just a matter of transcending it. You don't annihilate it. You can't annihilate some particular virtual statue contained in a block of stone. All you can do is just stop imagining it but it's still going to be in there. You just don't identify with it. You just transcend it. You just start thinking in terms of block of stone, or just stone, pure stone. And then you see all the different statues around you. It's all just stone, 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 stone. So, let's see, watermark. Did I answer the question? If nothing existed, how was any karma created in order for samsara to arise? No beginning and no end either, sorry to say. And so I guess I'm just going to move on to Watermarker's next question. In that vein, how did Mara come to be? And it's the same answer. I mean, every statue has always been in that block of stone, including every possible statue of Mara, who is like the Buddhist devil. He's more sophisticated than the Christian devil, because he's not just the god of evil, so to speak. He's the god of good and evil. He's the god of samsara. There's like this metaphor or simile in the Pali text of Brahma, who is sort of considered to be the creator god to the Vedic Brahmins. He's resting in the palm of Mara's hand, because Mara is essentially the god of samsara, and he lives in a heaven realm, not in hell. So if Mara can't get you to be bad, he'll get you to be good, because either way, you're just creating more karma that keeps you enmeshed in samsara. The main thing he's trying to stop people from doing is not doing good. It's from bailing out of the system by becoming enlightened. So Mara's always been there along with everything else. And I'm just going to move on to Watermarker's third question. He says, I'm living in Indonesia for a year, and I assume you have some experience with squat toilets. Any tips and tricks for a Westerner using a Southeast Asian toilet? Gosh, I mean, it seems pretty self-evident. It's not like it's a complicated piece of equipment there. You just squat over it and do your business, and then presumably wipe. Or like in Burma, I mean, wiping with paper is something that you don't do. And according to the ancient rules of monastic discipline for monks, you don't use toilet paper. First, you use a stick. It's ganudan is the Burmese word for it. Just a stick. And if it's got a little bit of bark on it, that's good, because it's got more traction. And then after that, you rinse with water. And that's the way people have been like cleaning their butts in like Southeast Asia for thousands of years, because apparently in the Indus Valley civilization, they did the same thing. They rinsed with water based on archaeological investigation of ancient outhouses, I guess. So, yeah, I mean, I worked on Japanese ships back in the 1980s, and most of those had squat toilets too. So even in Japan, up until recently, there have been squat toilets. It's just kind of, you just squat down over the hole and, let nature take its course. And then you use whatever means is available to rinse the narrow place or wipe or clean the narrow place. And then you get up and you go out and wash your hands like a good boy. I remember there's one monastery. Those of you who are squeamish about certain subjects might want to just fast forward past this part. But I did live at the one monastery I lived at longer than any other place in Burma. Wonbo Bemet Dojan, Wonbo Wildlife Refuge Monastery. I had this outhouse there, and you had to listen for the sound like thoop when you took a dump, because that meant that it was sliding off the end of the pipe into the cesspit. And if you didn't hear that thoop, that meant it was still in the tube, and you had to rinse it down with water. Otherwise, it was just going to dry there and plug up the tube. And when that happens, it's not good at all. So, it's an outhouse by outhouse basis with regard to stuff like that. Be careful of snakes, I guess. If it's like a forest kind of outhouse, you definitely want to look behind the water pot and look around before just walking in there. Because I remember one time, it was the day after the only other monk who lived at this monastery, Wonbo Bemet Do Monastery, is the same outhouse I referred to just a few minutes ago. He was bitten by a cobra and died. It was the day of his cremation. I go to the outhouse, I open the door, and there's a big Russell's viper just coiled up right next to the water pot. It wasn't the same snake that bit old Unandia. He was bitten by a cobra, I'm pretty sure. But you got to be careful about that kind of stuff. And you're not a monk, so you don't have to worry about all the rules. There's several rules regarding using an outhouse that monks are supposed to follow. No loud grunting, for example. Don't throw the butt wiping stick into the cesspit. Take your shoes off and your upper robe before going in. But that would be just a matter of local etiquette, I suppose. You'd have to be cognizant of, what the standard tradition is for how to use outhouses wherever you're going. I mean, if you're just living in Indonesia using your own bathroom, then you can do as you please, I suppose, but still you should definitely rinse or wipe and then wash your hands afterwards. But using water works better than toilet paper, I have to admit. I mean, feces is water soluble. It rinses away way easier than wiping with paper does. It's just that, of course, then you got like a narrow place that is rather wet. But if you're just wearing like a sarong with no underpants, which is what monks do in Asia, it's not a problem. And it works better than paper. In fact, in some Asian countries, like in Thailand, sometimes you'll have like a spray gun, like kitchen sinks often have in the West. You'll have one of those right next to the toilet. You just use that to spray. No toilet paper required. Anyways, I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, still formerly known as Liberlam. And he's asking questions on behalf of Siovach and Sipad Zirna. So we got more Siovach and Sipad Zirna questions here, 2 more. So Siovach and Sipad Zirna has not transgressed by asking a 4th question, not even indirectly through somebody else. So anyways, Siovach and Sipad Zirna, through Liberlam, also known as Stellar Supreme, asks, if mystical experiences are states where thinking is gone, and as a result you become more aware, then does a toddler or child who can't think yet, or even animals, count as being in mystical states? Not exactly. I mean, it could be a relatively mild mystical state. But, I mean, a mystical state isn't just not thinking in words. It's not perceiving. A mystical state is you are either not perceiving, you're still wide awake, and not like thinking or perceiving. I mean, at least it's so attenuated that you're getting a glimpse of what it's like if you're wide awake and not perceiving anything. There's gradations of mystical states. So in order to have a real, like a deep mystical state, like what a Catholic would call high contemplation, it's not just that you're not thinking in words anymore. You're not like imagining pictures, anything like that either. So yeah, a toddler or a child who can't think yet in words, still they're perceiving. They're still assuming the world that they are perceiving, all these objects and so forth, are reality, which means they're still stuck in samsara. Animals, maybe, because like Eckhart Tolle says, that all animals, except for a few domesticated ones that have become crazy through interacting with humans, are enlightened in a sense. But I think from his point of view, it's just that they're in the present moment. They're not thinking about the future, they're not thinking about the past. They're just right there in the present moment, even though they're still enmeshed in perception, which is samsara. So, I mean, there have been people who thought that small children are closer to enlightenment. And in a way they are, just like a cow is in some ways closer to enlightenment than a human. Their mind isn't as big as ours, so it can't hold as much delusion as ours can. It's just that for a cow, it's closer to enlightenment, but in a sense, enlightenment is behind it, and it's going to have to keep going forwards to, like transcend, or like outgrow, has to run its course. One analogy that Ram Dass gives is like the hands on an old analog clock, where it's like midnight is the absolute, and then it's like a being somehow arises from the unmanifest absolute. And of course they're closer to 12, but they got to go all the way around. When they get to 6, they start their return home, so to speak, until they get back to midnight again. So a child, I mean, in a way, you could say they're like at 3 o'clock. So they're closer to an adult at 6 o'clock, let's say, but still, they've got to still come full circle. So they're still farther away. And there is the sutta in one of the Sutta Pitakas, one of the Nikayas, I should say, that, I mean, it deals with the issue, is a baby enlightened? And the baby is not enlightened, partly because they still have anusayas, or latent tendencies. They still have latent karmic tendencies that just can't come to the surface yet, because, you know, it's like the perceptual system of the baby isn't fully formed yet, that kind of thing. The nervous system isn't fully worked out yet. And in a way, or like also Wordsworth, one of the greatest, one of the great giants of English literature that nobody reads anymore, William Wordsworth. He had this famous ode, Intimations of Immortality, talking about how little children, in a way, are closer to enlightenment because, sort of like Jesus says, they're seeing everything like a little child. You know, it's like they're seeing everything for the first time. When an adult sees a dandelion, they think it's just a weed, it's a dandelion. And, you know, it's like they stop even like really paying attention to that dandelion. They just, you know, it's just been labeled. They deal with the label and you know, they don't give it a second thought other than maybe a little bit of mild irritation if the dandelion is in their own yard. Whereas a little kid sees that dandelion as though seeing a flower for the first time, and they might think it's beautiful. You know, they might just be like enraptured by this dandelion. You know, they might go out and pick a handful of dandelions to give to mommy, that kind of thing. And the adults will think that's cute. You know, the child is so naive, it thinks dandelions are pretty flowers. But really, I mean, if you look at dandelions, some dandelions are kind of nice looking. But still, in a way, you could say they're closer to enlightenment in that their mind doesn't hold as much delusion as the average messed up adult. But still, they have all these latent tendencies, all this karma that they haven't worked through yet. And they're going to have to get farther away from enlightenment before they're even in a position to start getting closer to it again. But just not thinking in words is not a mystical state. It's either suppressing or transcending perception in general. Just symbolic thought in general, which includes all like images and colors and all that. So, CEO of Action Sipat Zidana's next question, asked indirectly through Stellar Supreme, still formerly known as Liberlam, etc., is as follows. What about 25 to 50% of the population who have no inner monologue? So this is just sort of like a corollary of the previous question, and it's the same answer, that even though they're not thinking in words all the time, still they are thinking symbolically and perceptually. They're still like in samsara because, you know, they see a tree and they just assume it's a real tree. You know, they think it's real. They're still just wallowing in symbols instead of dealing with like actual capital R reality. You know, they're still hyper samsaric, if you please. And so it'd be similar to the animal or the child who is going to have to get farther away from the absolute before they can start getting closer again. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Gordon. And Gordon says, do actors and musicians go straight to hell after they die? And there is a sutta where the Buddha is talking to an actor or some kind of entertainer. And the entertainer says that, you know, it's his belief that entertainers go to the realm of the laughing gods after they die because of all the joy and happiness that they give to other people. And then the Buddha says, no, you're going to hell. But this is another one of those suttas where, I mean, I have to be a little bit skeptical that all actors and all musicians are going to go to hell. Some of them will, presumably, assuming that there is such places as hell, some kind of hell realms. I mean, it's really not that far of a stretch to consider that there are worse places than Earth. But do actors and musicians go straight to hell after they die? I mean, the worst ones, the most like depraved, the evil ones. But I don't think that just being an actor or a musician is necessarily going to result in like a lower realm. And this, for some reason, I'm reminded of, I remember years ago seeing this article in which the guy who played Freddy Krueger, I don't even remember the movies. I never really liked that kind of movie. But I mean, those of you who are into horror movies know who Freddy Krueger was. The actor who played him is complaining that he's got like these weird stalkers and stuff, like really pestering him and just interfering with his peace of mind and so forth. And I remember at the time reading, it's like, what the hell do you expect? I mean, you're playing this nightmarish demon entity. And I mean, you're like poisoning people's minds with that kind of stuff. I mean, it's going to have karmic consequences. So people that are like doing like the satanic death metal stuff, or, you know, like playing murderers in slasher movies that are just like causing people nightmares at night, this kind of stuff. I mean, they're going to have worse karma than some relatively virtuous actor or musician. There are a few of those who are, you know, just trying to uplift others. You know, like someone who does kirtans, you know, they're just like playing sitar or tabla or something while people are chanting the names of God, that kind of thing. I mean, that's a far cry from like screaming about Satan in some death metal song, if you can even call that kind of throat screechy screaming stuff singing. Or for that matter, like a lot of this rap and hip hop stuff where you got these gangsta guys bragging about all the women they abuse and the laws they break and all this kind of stuff. I mean, that's like praising degeneracy and to some degree leading like young impressionable people astray. So that's definitely a far cry from singing gospel music. So yeah, I think there's a full spectrum, and I don't think that just being an actor or a musician is necessarily going to land you anywhere, heaven, hell, or anywhere in between. It's just your mental states. And some actors and musicians have way worse mental states than other actors and musicians. I had one musician tell me that he never really made it big in show business because all the ones who make it really big in show business have to worship Baphomet. I mean, he was kind of a conspiracy theorist kind of guy, but he apparently had some kind of experience with that sort of thing, I guess. And I mean, when people are like selling their soul to the devil, figuratively or in their opinion, literally, in order to get, you know, fame and wealth and all that, then that's a whole different issue altogether. And I will resist the urge to bring up Led Zeppelin with regard to that. And I guess I'm just going to go on to the next question. I do consider Led Zeppelin to be the greatest rock band of all time. So it's not like I'm totally have my mind poisoned against them. Okay, Gordon's next question is as follows. I read that practicing monks have much lower rates of Alzheimer's and dementia into old age. Does your experience corroborate this? Well, I don't really have enough of a sample size to determine whether it's statistically significant or not. You know, I can't really do the statistical analysis based on my own experience because I really didn't interact with a lot of really ancient monks. But it doesn't surprise me. I think that probably practicing monks do have much lower rates of Alzheimer's and dementia into old age, partly because they've abused their bodies less, or at least any abuse that they have done of their bodies was through asceticism, you know, fasting and just enduring heat and diseases and so forth. But I mean, they haven't like rotted their brains with like processed chemicals as much, or just, you know, vegetated in front of a TV set, that kind of thing, or, you know, just squander their lives with, you know, wallowing in sensuality. considering that to be the highest goal, that kind of thing. And so they've made less bad karma. They've lived kind of a simpler, cleaner, purer kind of life that has helped preserve their system. One of the reasons why I'm as healthy as I am, while as old as I am, is just the 30 years of following the straight and narrow, so to speak. And I mean, if you're really practicing meditation, then I mean, you're heightening your awareness, which would help to combat the loss of awareness through Alzheimer's, I would guess. So it's good karma, clean living, and also just exercising your mind in a wholesome way that would help to stave off dementia to a higher degree than living otherwise. I mean, I have met a few monks that I remember meeting Shui Umen Seattle and also another old monk who was about the same age as him, I would guess. And it was just the difference between night and day. Shui Umen Seattle, who was one of the most highly advanced, spiritually speaking, monks I ever met. I mean, he was about 90 years old at the time, at least in his 80s. And he was just wide awake. I mean, he was just looking right straight through you. He was 100% there. Whereas the other monk sitting next to him, I mean, he was just pretty much vegetative. And people would have to yell into his ear to try and get any point across. And still, it wasn't 100% sure whether he even heard what they were saying. So, I mean, Shui Umen Seattle was a very advanced practitioner, whereas the other monk maybe was not so much. And that may have been a factor. But I would assume that there is some kind of, I can acknowledge the likelihood that there is some kind of statistically significant correlation between, living like a simple, virtuous, meditative lifestyle, contemplative lifestyle, and not developing dementia in your old age. Just like there's probably a statistically significant correlation between not smoking and not getting lung cancer, or not chewing tobacco and not getting jaw cancer. It's some people, they smoke until they're 90, no problem. Like George Burns, he lived to be 100 years old. He's always had a cigar. So there's always going to be outliers. But as a general statistical trend, I think I'm fine with that. But again, I don't have enough experience with ancient monks to really have a large enough sample size to do any kind of statistical analysis. My N is relatively low. Well, for example, the old monk, he was in his mid-80s, I guess, when he was bitten by a cobra. And I mean, his eyesight was going. He had kind of like this blue haze over his eyes. His hearing was going. You had to yell. I mean, it was, any of you who have read, Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Remember old Mrs. Sliderskew? Where, I mean, she would pretend to understand what you were saying because she was so hard of hearing that, I mean, she would be too embarrassed to admit that, she keeps saying, what, all the time. So she would just kind of make up in her mind what you were saying and answer a question completely different from what you asked. Old Unandia was like that. And so, I mean, his eyesight and his hearing were going, his sensory organs were deteriorating, but still mentally, you could have a reasonable conversation with him so long as you talked loud enough that he could hear you. Or yelled, I should say. But yeah, I would accept that pretty easily, but I can't really provide the receipts really to prove it. And so I'm just going to move on to Gordon's next question. Would Nietzsche consider Buddhist ethics to be a type of slave morality? I don't really know enough about Nietzsche to know what he would say. It wouldn't surprise me. He was kind of going the opposite direction of Buddhism. Sort of glorify the ego, sort of will to power, all this kind of stuff. It's like you don't try to transcend samsara like his forerunner Schopenhauer was saying. It was like you just master samsara, more of like an Aleister Crowley approach. So, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if he just looked down his nose on Buddhist ethics as just some whimpering slave morality. But like I said earlier in this Q&A, of the the 8 famous philosophers on that test, I resembled Nietzsche the least. And I seem to recall in Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, well worth reading to anyone interested in Western philosophy. He has this imaginary conversation between Nietzsche and the Buddha, like a debate. And he didn't understand the Buddha very well. But still, even Bertrand Russell had this idea that Nietzsche and the Buddha were kind of diametrical opposites philosophically. But again, I've read very little Nietzsche. I've read The Antichrist, and I have to admit that Mencken's introduction to the Antichrist was more interesting to me, largely just because he had a more straightforward, simple writing style. And I started reading Thus Spake Zarathustra and got as far as the tightrope walker, falling off the tightrope and breaking his leg. And I just wasn't getting enough out of it, really, to inspire me to continue reading at that point. And I'm just going to move on to this question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, perhaps a few words on how dukkha is experienced by the wise. Well, wise people experience dukkha too. Anyone who isn't fully enlightened experiences dukkha. And some would say even a fully enlightened being still experiences physical pain. Like the Buddha was experiencing racking pains right before his death and parinibbana. So that kind of dukkha as physical pain, that's just kind of universal. So long as you have a physical body, that's going to happen, just in accordance with nature, I guess. But let's just keep it down to dukkha that is caused by desire and attachment. So how it's experienced by the wise, it would be more subtle. A lot of it, if you're wise enough to be mindful of it, then you can observe your own dukkha mindfully. I used to do that a lot as a monk. Sometimes I still do. It's like a standard example I would give is I lived in the hills in Burma for a while. And when I moved into that monastery, the abbot told me, we've got electricity here 24/7. And I was thinking, nah, that's not possible. Not in Burma. You're not going to have electricity 24/7 unless you're living in the same neighborhood as like the dictator. He has electricity 24/7. Nobody else does. And I was right. It would still go on and off at random. It's just that it would, go off maybe for a half an hour at random and go back on again, that kind of thing. And so anyways, it was up in the hills, in the foothills of the Shan Plateau, relatively, 4,000 feet elevation above sea level. And it gets cold there, especially in the wintertime. And so I would have to heat my water to take a bath. And so I'd get ready to start heating the water and the electricity would go off. And immediately, I could just observe this irritation arising, this sort of grumbling about, this idiots just cannot keep the electricity on. They're so incompetent, just this kind of stuff, just grumbling. And I just be mindful of that, just observe this. It's like, why am I unhappy? I want the electricity to work and it's not working. It's just a simple second noble truth. Desire is the cause of all suffering. I am unhappy right now. I am irritated because I desire the electricity to be working, which is stupid because all the desire in the world for the electricity to start working isn't going to cause the electricity to come back on. And so I could just sit there or stand there and just observe my own foolishness working itself out through force of habit. So, if a person is wise enough to be mindful, not fully enlightened, but wise enough to be mindful, at least they can mindfully observe their own foolish desires causing the suffering. And in a way, just by being mindful of the unhappiness, you're detaching from it. It's still there. It's just that you're not identified with it. You're just observing it, like an ichthyologist observing a dead fish. At some point, like anger or other forms of dukkha, if you detach from it enough, it's still there, but it's sort of like a flashing red light. It's in a way you've denatured it. Although there never was philosopher who could endure the toothache patiently, as Shakespeare is said to have said. I don't know what play that would be in. So dukkha, by a wise person, first of all, it would be more subtle. it wouldn't be as extreme, neither the happiness nor the unhappiness. You'd be more smooth sailing than the roller coaster ride of ecstasy misery of, say, a teenager in love. And then also, if you're mindful, even that like less extreme kind of dukkha can be observed mindfully, which helps to denature. It doesn't make it completely go away necessarily, but still, at least you can observe it and understand it. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Ethiopian Fake Tig, and we are getting down towards the bottom of the scroll here. So this won't be much longer than 2 hours, I'm pretty sure. Unless I just go off on this tangent talking about, I don't know, turtles or something. But I will resist the urge. Ethiopian Fake Tig says, while you were in Burma, you said you never stopped liking girls. Once you disrobed, was there a need to go after Asian girls since you spent most of your time around Asians? Not really. No. I mean, once I disrobed, I was back in America again, dealing, there were still Burmese ladies at the monastery, but one thing about Burmese women is they're very demure, very modest, and especially around monks, it's the Buddhist, like the devoutly Buddhist ones that I'd be interacting with, just very demure, very passive. They're not flirting with you or anything. There are a few times in Burma, village girls might flirt with me a little bit, just in the hopes that, I might not be a monk my entire life, and then I might just take her back to America with me, that kind of thing. There's a lot of that in Asia. But as a general rule, they're not dangerous. And also just the size difference. And also marrying a Burmese village woman, a devout Burmese Buddhist woman, would be sort of like a compromise. It'd be almost like marrying a nun. It's like you have a beer and she starts crying, that kind of thing. So, yeah, there's like the culture barrier, and there was to some degree like the size difference. And yeah, I have to admit that I did appreciate Southeast Asian women more after living in Burma for a while than before, because they're graceful. It's like carrying pots full of water on their head causes them to just glide when they walk, a lot of them anyway. And also, after living in Burma and being exposed to tiny, demure, dainty, graceful Burmese women, then I come back to America, just visiting my parents or whatever, and it did seem, just by comparison, that American women were big, loud, and clumsy. They weren't as dainty and demure, although overall I do consider like European, the European ethnicity of human female to be the most attractive, partly because there's like this instinctive desire to have a mate that is similar to your own phenotype, just for complex genetic evolutionary reasons. But also there's just more variety, different hair colors, different eye colors, different builds, different facial shapes. It's just, there's something for everybody, so to speak, unless maybe you're gay. So let's see, did I answer the question? Sometimes I have to read the whole question over again just to make sure I answered the question, because I have this tendency to digress, if you haven't noticed. Still haven't mentioned turtles yet, though. Okay, so was there a need to go after Asian girls since you spent most of your time around Asians? No, not really. I had more of an appreciation for Asian girls just from living amongst Asian people for more than 20 years, pretty much 30 years. But still, I realized that I would just fit better with a Western woman. Despite, Western women have their good points and bad points. Everybody has their good points and bad points. I mean, just the demureness of an Asian woman. It has its advantages when Western women aren't nearly as demure as Southeast Asian Buddhist village women. But all in all, I'm better off with a woman of my own people, so to speak. And I'm just going to move on to Ethiopian fake Tig's next question. There is a recent German monk by the name of Bhikkhu Analayo. He said that all the texts were written 200 years after the Buddha's death, and that we don't really know what kind of meditation he did or what he really said. Thoughts on this? Well, I think that the texts were written down, technically, at least, what was it, the fourth council? Yeah, I think it was the fourth council, was the council in Sri Lanka, I think, Ceylon, Lanka, that decided that the text should be written down. It was the ancient Indian tradition that is all memorized, that sacred scriptures are just memorized by heart. But in times of persecution, especially when like the monks who have memorized things, they get killed off or whatever, that it's better just to write it down. Like Confucius say, record written in palest ink is better than most retentive memory. So that would be like 500 years after the time of the Buddha. I'm not sure if Bhikkhu Analayo is what exactly he's referring to. I mean, there were some texts that were written down before then. They have found like old fragments of Buddhist texts in like Central Asia that may predate the Theravada Buddhist Fourth Council. Whether that was, but I mean, he's saying all the texts were written 200 years after the Buddha's death. It may be that what he means is that it was just sort of the Tipitaka was finalized, that texts stopped being added 200 years after the Buddha's death, but even that isn't true. So I'm not exactly sure where he came up with this 200 years. But let's just skip the 200 years and continue. He says that we don't really know what kind of meditation the Buddha did or what he really said. Yeah, we can't be 100% sure. All you can do is just do a little bit of detective work and just go with what seems to be the most likely. I mean, there's different approaches. Like the average Burmese Buddhist just considers everything in the Tipitaka to be 100% true. It's just gospel truth. Like the Jehovah's Witnesses look at the Bible, it's all got to be true. In fact, there's sort of a further step that the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Burmese Buddhists take, in that even the commentaries are infallible. With the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's those books that they always have with them to look into, and so that they can answer questions from the book of Jehovah's Witness commentary, essentially. And then the Burmese scholars actually consider the commentaries to be more authoritative than the texts themselves, although they wouldn't admit to this, simply because the interpretation of the text given in the commentary is considered to be true. So if the Buddha says blue, but the commentary says when the Buddha said blue, he really meant red, without the commentary, you wouldn't know that when he said blue, he really meant red. That's pretty much the attitude taken by like traditionalist Burmese Buddhist scholars, that the commentaries are actually more authoritative than the texts themselves, the Pali Tipitaka itself. But I mean, yeah, the Buddha was almost prehistoric. There's not a whole lot of like real history other than just the texts themselves that were handed down orally for a few centuries before they were written down and finalized in the form we see them today. So yeah, we don't know for sure what kind of meditation the Buddha did or what he really said, but I mean, you can look at the Pali texts, which are like the oldest complete version of the teachings of Buddha that we still have, unless they dig up something, underground and find something older. But the Pali texts are the oldest version of Buddhism we have, and you can like use like critical scholarship. It's like the same techniques that Bible scholars have used with regard to the Bible to determine what's the most ancient and what's most likely to be authentic, and what is a forgery that was added later, like so many of those epistles of Paul that aren't really by Paul. So you can do that kind of stuff to the Pali texts, and you can't reach 100% certainty, but still you can weed out a lot of the obvious deadwood, the talking animal stories and all this kind of stuff. The Buddha just grandiosely bragging about how wonderful he is and how people should worship him, and just flying up into the air and spraying fire out of one side and water out of the other, and then switching it up, then spraying the fire and water out of the other side just to impress some Brahmins, this kind of stuff. I mean, fighting fire-breathing dragons. I mean, you can weed out that kind of stuff. You can weed out texts that aren't common to all the earlier schools, so that you get down to like the core texts. And a lot of Western monks, they reject half the Tipitaka, including the entire Abhidhamma Pitaka, because only the Theravadins had the Theravada Abhidhamma. Other schools of Buddhism either had no Abhidhamma at all, or else they had a different kind of Abhidhamma. So you can get down to the core text, which is about half, and then you can start weeding out like the talking animal stories and the fire-breathing dragons and the Buddha bragging grandiosely, telling people they should worship him and all this kind of stuff. And then you get down to a smaller and smaller nucleus of stuff that is getting closer and closer to what the Buddha originally taught. And then you get a better idea as to what he likely taught. You get back to like the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata, and you're getting fairly close to what the Buddha was really teaching, in my opinion. So, let's see. Yeah, I mean, you just have to, it's educated guesses, unless you just want to be motivated by faith and accept all of it. So you can adopt sort of a medieval Catholic approach to Buddhist texts and just believe what you're told, which technically goes against the suttas, like the Kalama Sutta saying don't believe something just because it's a venerated tradition. Don't believe something just out of respect for your teacher. Don't believe something just because it seems like it ought to be true. I mean, you go to the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata and it's just don't believe anything. So I'm not exactly sure what the German monk Bhikkhu Analayo was really getting at. I'm not really well acquainted with Bhikkhu Analayo. So whether he was saying this just really just as an objective factor, whether he was using that as a justification for something, I really don't know. But I mean, it's aside from the 200 years thing, I don't know where he got that figure of 200 years. But yeah, I mean, we can't know for sure. I mean, we can't know anything for sure. We can't know 100% for sure what happened yesterday. It may be that the entire universe was created half an hour ago by a deity with a weird sense of humor, and he just implanted memories into us of stuff that didn't happen. We can't be sure. So there always has to be a certain amount of skepticism involved. Skepticism in the ancient sense, classical skepticism of just suspending judgment, just admitting that you can't be sure. And then you have to, but nevertheless, you have to go with some kind of worldview. You have to go with some kind of plan. And so you just come up with what seems plausible, what seems likely, and go with that as a working hypothesis. And when the Buddha's teaching like mindfulness, it is pretty likely that, just based on the emphasis mindfulness gets, that he did teach some mindfulness. Even the Atthakavagga is referring to that sort of thing. I mean, the Atthakavagga doesn't give detailed instructions on how to meditate, but at least it's saying, you're aware of what, like you're mindful. You stretch forth your arm, you're aware of stretching forth your arm, that kind of thing. Sampajanya, sometimes that is called. So, yeah, I have to, aside from the figure of 200 years, I don't know where he came up with that. I do have to admit that you can't really know for 100% sure what the Buddha taught, or what Jesus taught for that matter. We don't know. I mean, we can make educated guesses, and so it helps to use some intelligence, some critical thought, some detective work to try to, at least weed out the deadwood and get to a more solid nucleus of at least what is probably close to what the Buddha taught. And I suppose I should just move on to the next question. Also from Ethiopian Fake Tig. He says, on your last Q&A, you said the Buddha went back to ordain his son, but on a PBS documentary starring the Dalai Lama, it said that the Buddha's tribe was taken out by another kingdom and that he was very sad afterwards. I assume that was the Buddha was very sad afterwards, which would be kind of odd for a fully enlightened being to feel. Anyways, Ethiopian Fake Tig continues here and says, did this happen after he ordained his son, perhaps? Well, according to Theravadan tradition, the city-state of Kapilavatthu was not destroyed and genocided until after the Buddha's parinibbana. So, I mean, PBS documentaries really are not authorities on Buddhism, even if they got the Dalai Lama featured in the documentary. I mean, he's going to be going with Tibetan tradition, which may diverge considerably from Theravada tradition. But it's like watching a history documentary produced by CNN. And I've done that. And I watched a documentary the other night. It was a made-for-TV documentary. And even a person that is casually well-informed with regard to history can see that they're saying stuff that is just inaccurate, just objectively false. Stuff with regard to events in history, that kind of thing. Like CNN, I think, did a documentary on the Pope. And the very first episode, it's making these claims about, the Bishop of Rome during the Roman Empire and so forth that were just, where they came up with it, I don't know. It's just like people that were not like real authorities on the subject were just, getting a superficial understanding of things, which included some misunderstandings of things, and just making a documentary out of it. So, yeah, the city-state of Kapilavatthu, which was the Buddha's homeland, it was wiped out, pretty much genocided by, it might have been King Ajatasattu, but it was after the Buddha's parinibbana, at least according to Theravada Buddhist tradition. I mean, the Buddha did not live to see the destruction of his own homeland, at least according to Theravada Buddhist tradition. And even if he did, I don't think he was very sad afterwards. At least not from an Orthodox Theravada Buddhist position. A fully enlightened being would not be sad. So, yeah, it was definitely after he ordained his son Rahula. And it was long after that. At least according to Theravada Buddhist tradition. I don't know what the Dalai Lama's Tibetan tradition would say about it. But I do think that Theravadan tradition is an older tradition with maybe a little more footing in actual history than, a later, like a Vajrayana tradition of what happened in ancient India. And so I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Gruesome Revilement. And Gruesome says, what are the categories of karma? I've heard you mention good karma and bad karma before, using air quotes for the words good and bad. I believe I've also heard you say skillful and unskillful. What is the correct or most helpful way to think about different kinds of karma? Sorry if this is a newbie question. Thanks for the videos. Well, according to like Pali, the Pali language, Theravada Buddhist philosophy, you mainly have two kinds of karma, kusala karma and akusala karma. Like in Burmese, that becomes kudo and akudo. Kusala karma literally means skillful. Kusala karma literally means skillful action. Akusala karma literally means unskillful action. So good and bad, they're not as fundamental to Buddhist ethics as just what is skillful and what is unskillful. Skillful takes you closer to enlightenment. Unskillful takes you farther away from enlightenment. Skillful reduces your desires and attachments. Unskillfulness increases your desires and attachment. But using skillful and unskillful in ethics in modern English, it's kind of awkward, maybe. It's just not as intuitive for an English speaking modern person than an ancient Indian philosopher. And so sometimes it's kusala and unkusala are interpreted or rendered in English as wholesome and unwholesome. But then also, I mean, just in common parlance, you just say good karma, bad karma. But really, in the original Pali, it's kusala karma, skillful action, and akusala karma, unskillful action. And I'm pretty sure there is no neutral karma. Karma is either going to be it's going to be a kind of momentum to your psychic momentum. It's going to change your psychic momentum or reinforce your psychic momentum, or de-enforce your psychic momentum. So it's going to have some kind of effect one way or the other. So neutral karma, and it doesn't have any effect, is not a thing, I'm pretty sure. It's either kusala or akusala, literally skillful or unskillful, a little less literally wholesome or unwholesome, and way less literally good and bad. But I mean, that's not all the categories of karma. There's lots of categories of karma, and I just happen to have Ñāṇatiloka's Buddhist dictionary here, which is well worth having to anybody who is a student of Theravada Buddhism. And so you look under karma, because they use the English word, because karma is an English word. And let's see. It divides. See, here, the very first thing it says, action, correctly speaking, denotes the wholesome and unwholesome volitions, kusala and unkusala cetana, and their concomitant mental factors, causing rebirth and shaping the destiny of beings. So, according to Ñāṇatiloka, really, there are only wholesome and unwholesome. There is no neutral karma. Unless, forget that. There's no unless. But if you keep going with this, you find that there's other, let's see, like there's the tenfold wholesome and unwholesome course of action. The 5 hellish crimes with immediate result. That would be karmic. Here there's 3 kinds of karma. Karma ripening during this lifetime, which is dita dhamma vedaniya karma. You've got karma ripening in the next birth, which is upapajja vedaniya karma. And then you've got karma ripening in later births, which is aparapariya vedaniya karma. And then those are divided into 2 kinds. You've got, let's see here. If they, with regard to karma that's going to have its fruition in this life, karma that's going to have its fruition in the next life, and karma that's going to have its fruition in a life after that, then you've got the karma that actually leads to this fruition, and then you've got what is called ahosi karma, or like has-been karma, that just the conditions weren't ripe for that to happen. And so it just expires. It has like an expiration date. Some karma has an expiration date, so to speak. Other karma, it just fades out if the conditions that would allow it to arise and reach fruition just don't happen. So maybe you have some kind of karma that's going to cause you to be born as a prince, a royal prince, but it's like the waiting list for being reborn as a royal prince is long, and eventually it's just there's no convenient opportunity. There's not very many royal princes anymore in this world, not as many as there used to be. And so just the opportunity just doesn't arise until finally that karma just fades out. Then it would be called ahosi karma, or like has-been karma. Let's see here. Yeah, and then there's just all these lists. I mean, you get into technical Theravada Buddhist philosophy, and they're going to analyze everything to death, especially like in Abhidhamma and the commentarial tradition. So you've got regenerative or productive karma, which is janaka karma. You've got supportive or consolidating karma, which is upatambaka karma. You've got counteractive or suppressive or frustrating karma, which is, let's see, upapilaka karma. And then you've got destructive destructive or supplanting kama, which is upagataka or upachedaka kama, etc., etc. And then there's just more lists of these different kinds of divisions. But the main division, the main categories of kama for a gruesome revilement here are kusala and akusala. Kusala is skillful or wholesome or good. Akusala is unskillful or unwholesome or bad. And the kusala kama reduces your desires, reduces your attachments, gets you closer to enlightenment. And the akusala or unskillful kama does the opposite. That's like the two main divisions you need to worry about. You don't need to be studying these lists of, the different categories of kama, like what their effects are, what their conditions and relations are, that kind of stuff. I mean, you could just follow this, go down the rabbit hole of just analyzing everything to death easily if you get into like scholastic Theravada, where you've had monks with nothing better to do, that maybe they don't meditate very well, so they just dedicate their lives to scholarship and just analyzing and analyzing and analyzing and just writing commentaries and sub-commentaries and sub-commentaries, just like categorizing and systematizing everything. I think the medieval Catholics did the same thing in Europe. Just analyze everything to death. But the word killeth and the spirit maketh alive. So you're better off with spirit than letter. I mean, you need a certain amount of textual information to just get you going in the right direction, to tell you how to meditate and why you should meditate. But once you learn that stuff, the books aren't nearly as important. I mean, there's certainly no more need to like study all these various categories of kama than there is to study dream interpretation. It's just a kind of distraction. And some monks will capitalize on that just because they really don't meditate very well. They don't like meditation or some such. So they'll just say, well, I'm just going to go the scholarly route. And in Sri Lanka, getting back to the question a while back about Sri Lankan Buddhism, there is a common belief in Sri Lanka that nobody can become enlightened anymore. So there's no point in even trying. And so a lot of the monks will use that as a justification for not practicing much and just going the route of scholarship and studying the books. So anyways, I'm moving on to the next question. Let's see. Fred. The next question is from Fred. Fred says, can we really transcend the samsara with a lizard brain in operation calling the emotional shots? And yeah, I think we can. Because the lizard brain, which is calling the emotional shots, I mean, you don't necessarily have to enslave yourself to that. You can detach from that. You can transcend the lizard brain and just human nature in general. And again, we're talking at two different levels of reality. You've got this level of samsara with all this shit going on. And then through mindfulness and mysticism and detachment, I mean, you can just focus more on the block of marble than on the various statues or on any statue in particular or any group of statues in particular. So, I mean, from this point of view, from like the samsaric empirical point of view, even an enlightened being is still going to have like the amygdala in the brain, the various like lizard emotional centers of the brain that are still functional. So, certain mental states or emotions or whatever are still going to arise. It's just that the enlightened being is no longer identified with that. He's no longer enslaved to that. He has transcended that level of reality. It's still kind of there, but it's just not the main focus anymore. Kind of like what I was saying about that one of the world's leading authorities on obsessive compulsive disorder, where you cure somebody of obsessive compulsive disorder, it doesn't mean that the urges, like the compulsions and so forth, just completely go away. They're still there. It's just you learn to detach and not react to it. You don't identify with it more. It's not me, it's the OCD. And I think that just any kind of full enlightenment is going to be along those lines. That unenlightened urges or just like human nature is still going to be there. It's just that you've transcended that. It's no longer you anymore. It's just nature taking its course. And that includes the lizard brain. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Cyrus Frame, and this is the last question. The very last one on this episode. Cyrus Frame says, when you were a monk, how did you guard the sense doors? Simple question. And guarding the sense doors is really emphasized in the Pali text. The monk is supposed to guard the sense doors. And there's different ways of doing it. One way of guarding the sense doors is you just go off into the forest and live in a cave. So you're guarding the sense doors in that like a mechanical way, just by avoiding excess stimulation. You're staying out of town. You're staying away from all this tumultuous like human interaction that can distract you and lead you away from practicing Dhamma correctly. So you just go alone like the horn of the rhinoceros. You go off and live in a forest. Spend hours every day staring at the wall of a blank wall of a cave or whatever it is. So that would be like the superficial mechanical way of guarding the sense doors is, you just remove yourself from society and just go out and live a very simple life with not a lot of distraction and stimulation. Also, just being moral is a way of guarding the sense doors indirectly, following all these precepts and just minimizing the amount of bad karma you generate or akusala karma you generate. That, in a way, is guarding the sense doors kind of defensively, preemptively, by you're making less bad karma that's going to cause less like distraction and interruption and upheaval and so forth. But when you get to more advanced level guarding the sense doors, what you're doing partly is just being mindful, which is detaching yourself from everything you're experiencing. So that's a way of guarding the sense doors, is through mindfulness, where let's say a loud noise starts happening, a dog starts barking. If you're guarding the sense doors, it's just you're mindful of hearing. It's just like raw auditory data. You're not interpreting it. You're not wondering who the dog is, whose dog is that? Why is the dog barking? You're not going off on these chains of association. It's just hearing, hearing, hearing. That is guarding the sense doors. That's one example of it anyway. And then if you get into like deep meditative states, then you're kind of tuning out, especially if you're doing samatha meditation, you're tuning out, what little stimulation is still out there and just focusing inwardly, which is more radical guarding of the sense doors. And that's just temporary because you can't be that way all the time. Sometimes you've got to get up and move around. You've got to go for alms round in the village. And in that case, you have to be very careful about guarding your sense doors because, going for alms is one of the most stimulating experiences a monk has over the course of his day. A lot of the time, it's like the most opportunity for shit to happen. So, you've got pretty girls walking around in the village sometimes, or you've got somebody putting something really disgusting into your bowl. Some little old lady puts cake into your bowl that's swarming with ants and her eyesight is not good enough. She doesn't see it. She's just offering you this cake in good faith, but the ants found it before she did or before you got it. Or like you get a good piece of cake with no ants on it. The very next lady just pours soup onto it. And it's like, great lady, you just poured soup all over my cake. So when you go for alms round, all of a sudden it's like, relatively speaking, sensory overload. And so that is when it's very important. You look downwards. Like when a monk is in public, he's supposed to be looking downwards at all times, unless there's some real need for it to look up. So that's guarding the sense doors also. You're not checking out all the pretty girls, and then you just accept your food with like gratitude and a poker face. Even if someone with leprosy is offering food into your bowl, you're not cringing. They're offering something you just really can't stand, something disgusting into your bowl. You're not making faces. It's just visual stimuli. If you're really being mindful, you're just looking down, accepting the food attentively, but you're not critiquing it. You don't have this running commentary going. And that's what guarding the sense doors really amounts to, at that level anyway, is you're just being mindful. And it's like sensory data. In the seen, there is only the seen. In the heard, there is only the heard. In the felt, there is only the felt, etc. It's not like you're critiquing stuff, criticizing, have any kind of running dialogue going, any kind of commentary going on that's just kind of taking you away from the present moment. That also is guarding the sense doors. And that's, in a way, it's one of the main ways of guarding the sense doors that are referred to in the suttas, where you're just not like following along any kind of stimulus. The stimulus isn't like distracting you from just being right here, right now in the present moment, and just accepting all these stimuli as just sensory stimuli rather than that dog is barking and it's bugging me. It's just sensory stimuli. That is guarding the sense doors. It's like protecting you from making akusala kama and just like wallowing in samsara. It's like the unenlightened mind's one of its best tools for just not getting just sucked into samsara and completely distracted and led astray by it. And that's it. And my throat is pretty much hash right now. But that's all right too. It's just kind of a wet, gray, rainy day. And somehow wet, gray, rainy days cause scratchier throats than usual, I think. But, like I should always say at the beginning, and pretty much never do, if you have any questions you think I can answer about Dhamma, Dharma, Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism, what early Buddhism was likely to be like, meditation, monastic discipline, living in Burma, living in Buddhist Asia, philosophy in general. If you think that there's a good chance I'd be able to answer your question intelligently, and you don't want to resort to AI to answer your questions, which is an easier and easier thing to do nowadays, feel free to ask. No more than 3 questions per person per episode, please. And look at let's see, what is it? The URL links below. And I've still got another book coming out soon. In fact, technically, I've got 2 books coming out soon because somebody has generously printed up more than 100 copies of my Atthaka Wagga translation that is going to be sent to me. And so I will be able to distribute those. I don't have the monetary wherewithal to send them all out completely for free, but anyone who wants to pay for the postage, I mean, it's free besides the however much it costs the postal service to send it. And I'm still waiting for the illustrations on the memoirs from Myanmar, the writings of a incendiary monk series. That's pretty much done. I'm still waiting for the illustrations to be finished. And aside from that, all I say is be happy.